All right, so hi everyone. I hope you've had a great weekend. Today we'll be talking about the final section in chapter 3, which is evolutionary psychology. So I wanted you to consider the following question, and I mentioned this in our last lecture. So why are psychologists interested in evolution? Normally when we think of evolution, we think of biology, maybe a little bit of anthropology, history. So why would psychologists, people that study the mind and behavior, be interested in evolution? So we ended up talking about behavior geneticists in the last PowerPoint. So whereas behavior geneticists may be more interested in the ways in which individuals differ and ask questions like who's more likely to engage in risky behaviors, why do some people score higher than others on tests of cognitive ability? Evolutionary psychologists are more interested in asking questions like why do people perform these risky behaviors at all? And what is the benefit to humanity or to people's livelihood to engage in these kinds of behavior? So evolution is still a pretty controversial topic. And when I talk about it being a controversial topic, I mean that it's controversial in among people in general. I think that evolution is not really a controversial topic for scientists or empiricists. We believe that there's sufficient evidence to support the theory of evolution. But in 2009, only about 39% of Americans believed that in evolution, which is really surprising, or maybe not so surprising, given that many people don't want to wear masks in response to coronavirus. But this was thankfully moderated by education, right? So 74% of those with postgraduate degrees believed in evolution, whereas only 21% of those with high school educations did. So we'll be talking about evolution as being both a fact and a theory. But what does this mean? So let's distinguish between a fact and a theory first. So a fact is something that exists. So this is actually happening in time and space. So there's an observation that has been confirmed so often that it would be unreasonable to deny it. So the fact is that every day begins usually with the sun rising, right? So that's a fact. We see it. We've seen it for the entirety of our lives, and it happens so often that it's unreasonable. It would be unreasonable to deny it. A theory, however, is an interconnected set of ideas or statements that are used to explain or organize the facts. Okay, great. So some facts about evolution is that the Earth is at least 4.5 billion of years old. Cellular life has been around for at least half of that period. We also know that all current forms of life come from previous but different life forms. In the most basic sense, we can say that us as humans come from a different but similar life form, our parents, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a fact. And we also know that birds arose from non-birds and humans arose from non-humans. These are facts about evolution. Now, the theory of evolution comes from Charles Darwin, and hopefully you heard about this in your biology classes in high school. If not, I can give you a quick refresher. So Charles Darwin's theory was about how the most important types of evolutionary events occur. And it's really based on the fact that species could grow theoretically without limit. So for humans, for example, we're only limited by the number of months that women can carry a child, so 9 months. But given that there are billions and billions of people on this earth, there could be at least 1 billion women who are pregnant and give birth to another billion babies, right? So we are unlimited in the number of species that we as a whole group could produce. However, the resources to support these species is finite, right? So we're running out of land, we're running out of water, there's only so much electricity, there are only so many jobs. So because these resources are limited, that creates competition. So we want to make sure that people that belong to our group have sufficient resources to continue living. So, in addition to that, we also know that living organisms of a species vary in their characteristics. So those with the best characteristics, depending on the environment, will produce the most offspring, right? So if we look at it through an evolutionary perspective, cavemen, for example, the strongest and the fastest would be most likely to be able to kill an animal, to be able to feed themselves, and to be able to use the meat that they gain from killing that animal to show to a potential mate that they would be able to provide for the mate as well as the mate's children. Another facet of natural selection is that offspring tend to resemble their parents. So let's say that caveman who was able to kill that elk, for example, and showed his mate that he was able to kill that elk. He has strength, he has speed, he has intelligence. So if he mates with a woman and they have a child, the child is likely to carry on those genes of strength, intelligence, and so on. So in that way, the genes that are best suited to the environment are reproduced into the next generation. So that's how natural selection occurs. If we have someone who's not as strong, someone who might be weaker, someone who might be slower, someone who might be not as intelligent, they have a lower probability of successfully mating with another member of their group, which means that their genetic information dies. So only the strongest survive in Darwin's theory of evolution. In addition, incremental changes occur in the characteristics of members of a population over many generations, right? So although you might inherit a little bit of strength, maybe the progeny of that strong, smart, fast caveman, maybe in the future they need to be able to swim because that family moves to a coastal region. So now, if they move to a coastal region, they might get better and better at swimming across time. So there's a natural filtering process of certain genes across time. Again, your genes must match your environment. Great. So we just talked about evolution from a biological perspective, right? So what sorts of genes can reproduce, what sorts of genes survive across time. Now let's talk about how evolution is able to commingle with psychology to create evolutionary psychology. So when evolutionary psychologists examine problems, they look at old problems through a different lens. So they might look at old problems like sexism, right? So let's say that men have these gender roles and women have these gender roles, and they're meant to adhere to these gender roles. So men are supposed to be strong, women are supposed to be beautiful, and they're supposed to stay at home and care for the children. So how would that make sense from an evolutionary perspective? So evolutionary psychologists would argue that men's strength and adherence to these social roles are because of the evolutionary necessity for men to be the hunters and for women to be the gatherers. So if you use that analogy to extrapolate those roles to current society, then it would make sense how men still have these social roles of being a strong provider, whereas women have the social role of staying at home and taking care of the children. But, like I mentioned before, when we talk about evolutionary psychology, those with the best characteristics, depending on the environment, will produce the most offspring. So having those beliefs might not fit into our current environment, right? So we have the feminist movement, we have women who want to go out and work. So even though those roles might have fit better in other centuries or times during our evolutionary history, maybe the roles of men being the strong providers no longer hold. So evolutionary psychology is also an interdisciplinary perspective. So it includes evolutionary biology, which is most of what I've discussed so far. It includes computer science to model differences across time. It involves social psychology and other fields. So overall, what I'll be talking about today are psychological adaptations and environmental mismatches as the subheadings within evolutionary psychology. So what are psychological adaptations? So psychological adaptations are mental characteristics that evolved through natural selection. So we work together in a coordinated fashion, but each of these characteristics evolved for a specific purpose. So for example, we have prejudice. So prejudice is a negative feeling or affect towards specific groups. And when during our evolutionary history, maybe having positive feelings towards our own tribe and having negative feelings towards competing tribes helped us survive, right? So it helped us be wary of other people. It helps us avoid any kinds of infectious diseases that others might carry. It helps us build cohesion within our groups. So prejudice might have evolved through an evolutionary process, though now it isn't as adaptive to hold those beliefs. So psychological adaptations also provide us with solutions to specific types of problems encountered over evolutionary time by our human ancestors. And our minds possess a vast number of these highly specialized psychological adaptations. So our first theory comes from evolutionary theory. So for example, Charles Darwin said that we seek relationships that maximize the survival of our genes. And because of this, females must be selective in choosing their partners. So women tend to be biologically limited in the number of kids that they can have and raise. So let's say that the average age of beginning menstruation for women is 13. And by the time they go into menopause, they are, let's say, 50. That gives you about 37 years to have children. Within those 37 years, each child takes about 9 months to carry. So if you were to have a child every year, you could probably have between 37 and maybe 50 something if you had twins and triplets and didn't really have any time between children, right? So you're biologically limited in the number of kids that women can raise. So 37 and 50, let's just say that's a rough estimate. However, males can be less selective and mate with many, right? So let's say that the first time that men have the hormonal capacity to impregnate a woman, let's just say for quality's sake, it's between 14 and 50. So again, they have about 36 years that they can impregnate a woman. They're not limited in 9 months, right? So every day, if they could have sex every day and successfully, they could successfully impregnate every woman, they can impregnate hundreds, if not thousands of women, right? So men are able to father lots of kids. Because of this difference in the number of kids that females versus males can produce, females tend to be more selective in choosing a partner. They want to make sure that they are selecting a partner who will not only care for them, but also care for their child, that will help them rear their child and produce for both them and their children. Whereas males, they can just have as much sex as they want, and they don't really have to be there for the woman, so they can be less selective, right? It isn't as costly for them if they impregnate many women, at least through an evolutionary perspective. Now, with child support, it might be a little more financially costly, but from an evolutionary perspective, it was worth it for men to sleep with many, many women to guarantee that their genes would be reproduced. So, is there supporting evidence from evolutionary psychology to support this point? Yes. So there's a universal preference for particular ages. So men seek younger women. So on this graph, we have on the x-axis a man's age. And as we continue going down this line, this is supposed to be the y-axis, women's age. So when men are 20, they think women who are 20 look best. When they're 31, they think that women who are 20 look best. When they're 38, they think that women who are 20 look best. When they're 47, they think that women who are 20 look best. And when they're 49, they think that women who are 20 look best. So why could this be the case? So from evolutionary psychology, the argument is that no matter a man's age, they seek women that they can reproduce with so that they can continue their evolutionary or genetic lineage. So for men, they're interested in being able to reproduce and guarantee their genetic lineage. Women, however, tend to desire older men. So, for example, women at 20 think a man who's 23 looks best. Women at 31 think someone who's 31 looks best, on average. Women who are 32 tend to think that someone who's 31 looks best. Women who are 45 tend to think that someone who's 40 looks best, and women who are 49 tend to think that men who are 45 look best. So this, again, is in line with evolutionary theory, right? So women don't just want a partner to be able to reproduce with, they also want a partner who can provide financially for them, who can provide for not only them, but their children as well, and they want a partner. Whereas men, from an evolutionary perspective, seek someone who can carry on their genetic information. And an important note here is that even though, let's say you are a 20-year-old male in this class, you're like, nope, I don't want to get anyone pregnant. So what evolutionary psychology would argue is that you don't have to have an explicit desire to continue your genetic lineage, but this is encoded in our genes to want to perpetuate our genetic lineage. So it's something that happens implicitly or below conscious awareness. There's also another theory that could be in support of evolutionary psychology. So this is the experience of jealousy for different reasons that occurs. So I think my batteries are dying, so I'm going to have to pause. Eric, I need batteries. Now. What's wrong, babe?
Nothing. I can't log into my work computer.
Oh, you had to change your password.
No, it's not that.
You had to change your password.
No, I did. It's not that. Like, remote desktop won't connect. I got into the sequence. This is not going to work on that.
Oh, God. I'm sorry, babe.